When I first started researching the possibility of coming back to this part of the country here at Pittsburg, Kansas, which I actually had lived just a few miles from here back in the mid-'80s, so I was a little bit familiar with it. I saw that Vance Randolph was actually born here in Pittsburg, and of course I grew up in Fayetteville, which is where his last home was and where he died in 1980. But I find it interesting now that I have lived in both where he was born and where he died, but not in all the areas in between. But Vance Randolph, I believe, has kind of flown under the radar a little bit as far as local history, Pittsburgh history, but he was the sort of the preeminent Ozark folk historian. Let me see if I can get this wireless mouse to cooperate. Yes. And he published quite a few books throughout his life, starting around the 1920s through the 1960s, 70s, and then after his death in 1980, there were some more collections of his folk tales. But I'll just kind of briefly give an overview of his life. You can see there the biography that came out about 20 years ago on him on the left, and just two of the books that he did. He did scholarly works on Ozark folk living, folk tales, folk songs, plus just collections. He was born here in Pittsburgh in 1892. His father was a local teacher who taught and even was head of the schools up in Girard for a while, and then later in late 1890s, early 1900s was an attorney here in Pittsburgh. His mother was a longtime head of the public library here in Pittsburgh. So he kind of came from a well-to-do family. He attended the State Manual Training School, which is now what we are, 1911 to 1914. Although he was not a serious student, he never did complete public schooling here in Pittsburgh when he was a student. He dropped out, but somehow was allowed to enroll at this university just about 8 years after it began, and got his degree there. He was here, coincidentally, in 1914 during the historic Russ Hall fire. And his account of it, which he never wrote down, but it appears in some interviews, is a little bit different than our account of it. But it is interesting. After he graduated from Pittsburgh, he went to Clark University, which is up in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he got his master's degree in psychology. So he was kind of leaning towards a professional career, a serious career, and after that he enrolled as a PhD student at the University of Kansas, came back home, enrolled up at Lawrence, but did not finish, took some classes there. And right after that, he taught for a few years at Pittsburgh High School, taught science. He was fired from that job for just one of those things when you work in a small town, you got to watch what you do, and he wasn't watching it too carefully. His morals, they said, weren't exactly what they were looking for at the time, so he was sort of dismissed from that position. There's a picture of him there on the upper left from the yearbook here at the school here, so you can see what he looked like back when he was a student here. When he was a teacher here at Pittsburgh High School, he appeared in their little yearbook as well, teaching biological science. It was around 1916. So he would have been about, do the math, 24, 25 years old, I believe, at that time. He got connected with the Socialist publishing groups that were living over in Girard, our county seat here. It began in the 1890s by Julius Wayland, and after his death in 1912, a man named Emanuel Haldeman-Julius took over the Socialist publishing and published a series of small, inexpensive pamphlets called the Little Blue Books. And Vance Randolph began his writing career writing for the newspaper that was published in Girard. It was a socialist newspaper called the Appeal to Reason. And Vance Randolph began to take, this is pre-Ozark folk tunes, and even though he grew up here, he really did not even visit the Ozarks until the very, very late 1800s, early 1900s. But at this time, he's just working. He's just making a living. So he's working as a reporter for the Appeal to Reason in Girard, Kansas. And this is another picture of him in the 1920s, just a few years after that. The man he would work for and who really helped him establish a writing career was Emanuel Haldeman-Julius, the Socialist publisher, who lived from 1889 to 1951. And he hired, and in addition to continuing the Appeal to Reason newspaper, he published these little pamphlets called the Little Blue Books, in which they were usually sold for a nickel or a penny, mass-produced by the thousands, and just disseminated all across the country. His goal was to put reading in the hands of anybody. He didn't want anybody not being able to afford to read literature. So he would publish things, just you name it, every subject was covered. And these are some of the Little Blue Books that Vance Randolph published in the 1920s. Did one on ancient philosophers, science, things, nature, the life among the butterflies. And then he continues doing this off and on throughout the 1920s and 30s and into the 40s, where you start seeing some of his publications or wild stories from the Ozarks. And these are usually about anywhere from maybe 20 to 40 page pamphlets. And they were small. They were called Little Blue Books. And he did some, after a while, he started doing some that were about twice as big, called the Big Blue Books, but they were still about the size of a trade paperback. Another one that Randolph published was called Tall Tales from the Ozarks. Being from the Ozarks, of course, I have to say, we have no tall tales down there. They're all true. But he also wrote more than he's credited for, because he published some of them under pseudonyms. The one he did on Buffalo Bill Cody, he published under the name William Yancey Shackelford, and he wrote another brief biography on Carrie Nation, which he, I'm trying to read what that pseudonym is, Anton Booker. But those that we know now have been credited to him. It was around the 1930s that Vance Randolph started living down in Pineville, Missouri, which is closer to the Ozarks than we are here. And he started getting interested and realizing that nobody was collecting this folk music. And there had been efforts throughout the world of famous educators, musicians that going around their regions, recording and documenting these folk tales that are just passed on through oral tradition, so they wouldn't be forgotten. And so Vance Randolph became one of the first people to do it in the Ozarks. And this is a picture of him early 1940s on the porch of somebody's shack recording some songs. And he would record them, and he would write them down, but he would keep the recording, both the songs and the stories, exactly as he heard them, as they pronounced it, bad grammar and all, because that really authenticates it. Because these are uneducated people, but they've passed on these stories, of which I'll read a couple to you in just a minute, through several generations. I just wanted to show you, and he was also a pretty good photographer. He'd take photographs of the people he'd interview, and these are just some of the people that he talked to in North Arkansas and southern Missouri. Just what you would kind of expect to see when you see representations of the typical hillbilly or Ozark resident. Randolph turned his serious academic writing to Columbia University in the late 1940s, and one of his first books, and this is not the first edition, but a reprint, but one of the first books he published in 1947 through the Columbia University Press was called Ozark Magic and Folklore. And then he started following this up, most of these through the academic press, the Columbia University Press with more collections. And he was collecting these tales by the thousands and songs as well. One of them was called We Always Lie to Strangers, Tall Tales from the Ozarks. That was 1951. The Devil's Pretty Daughter was published in 1955 by the Columbia University Press. And Sticks in the Knapsack, 1958, just a lot of collections of them. Some of them are just a few paragraphs long, and some of them are several pages long. In the mid-1930s, 1935, he did publish a novel called Hedwig, which is based in this region, although he changes the name of Frontenac and Pittsburg, but it is sort of a novel based on the immigrant history of this area and the mining and the miners and just the hardships that they endured. It was actually very well received, but was not very profitable throughout throughout his publishing history. We have a couple of these in the special collections and in the library here at Pittsburg State. This is just another picture of Vance Randolph in the late 1930s. And this quote here is something that he once said about his stories. He said, "I don't write my books. The backwoods people I get them from do that for me. All I do is go out and collect them, bring them home and do a little editing, but not much editing. A folktale's charm lies largely in its lack of polish. If you polish them up, you ruin them." And he throughout, if you look through his papers, which I think the bulk of them are at the Library of Congress, although there's small collections of some of his personal papers and Vance Randolph material in a lot of libraries in this part of the country, including ours, down at the University of Arkansas, University of Missouri. You'll see that not only did he collect just the standard folk tales and folk songs, but he also collected the off-color songs and stories, and they've been published since he passed away in 1980, which probably could not have gotten them published up until about the 1970s, 1980s. And if you read them, they're vulgar, they're obscene, but these are authentic tales that people have passed down, and he saw that if he didn't collect those, that nobody else would. This is the picture of him about 9 years before he died. He lived out his last years down in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where he passed away in 1980. I want to just read a couple of the folk tales that he collected. And like I said, he did some that were fairly lengthy and some that were fairly short. And this one is one of the shorter ones. And I'll try to capture the articulation and the colloquialisms and the style of that these folk people used when they told him these stories. This is called "He Stayed All Night." One time, young Lum Anderson come to see one of the Witherspoon girls, and they sat on the porch till after 9 o'clock. Then it began to rain, so she took him in the parlor. When a boy was sparking a nice girl in them days, he was supposed to go home at 10 o'clock. But Lum just sat there, and the girl didn't like to run him off because it was raining so hard outside. The Witherspoons sat up till pretty near midnight, thinking maybe Lum would go home. But the rain just kept a-pouring down, and there was Lum and the girl sitting in the parlor. Finally, old man Witherspoon come downstairs, and he says it is time for decent people to be in bed. "Young man," says he, "I don't want to put anybody out in this storm, so you better stay with us tonight. We will fix you up a bed in the sitting room." Lum, he just grinned. "Thank you, sir," he says. "It is mighty kind of you to invite me." So then the girl and her mother went in the other room to fix a bed for Lum, and the old man Witherspoon tromped back upstairs. Pretty soon, the women folks heard the front door slam, and there was Lum running down the road in the rain. The girl and her mother thought it was funny for him to leave so sudden after he'd stayed all that time. But you can't ever tell what a boy's going to do. And it did seem kind of foolish for him to stay all night when he lived only a quarter of a mile away. But just as they was getting ready for bed, here come a loud stomping on the porch and somebody pounding on the door. When old lady Witherspoon went to see who it was, in come Lum again. He was wet as a drowned rat, with water running off him onto the carpet. He had a bundle of white flannel under his arm, and it was sopping wet too. "Why, Lum," says the old lady Witherspoon, "we thought you had went home." The boy just stood there a-looking at her. "Mr. Witherspoon asked me to stay with you folks," says he, "so I had to run home and get my nightshirt." The girl and her mother just stared at Lum with their mouth open for a minute, and then the girl began to giggle. Even the old lady had to grin a little bit. But Lum's bed was all fixed, and they give him one of the old man's dry nightshirts to sleep in, so Lum stayed all night with the Witherspoons after all. But the story got out some way, and lots of people was laughing about it. Folks that live in little towns where everybody knows all their neighbors get a big kick out of things like that. It happened a long time ago, but there's old settlers around here yet that remember the joke about Lum Anderson's nightshirt. And they will bust out laughing to this day if anybody says something to put them in mind of it. Another one that he wrote, or collected, I should say. He didn't write these, he collected them. It's called The Stranger in the Beans. One time a fellow was a-traveling, and he stopped at a log house to stay all night. There was a man and a woman in the cabin, but they didn't have no children. They sat down to supper, and the main dish was green beans seasoned with sow belly. It was mighty good too, but the man and the woman were both light eaters. The stranger only got about half as much as he wanted because he was minding his manners and didn't want to look like he was greedy. When supper was over, there was a lot of beans left, and the woman put the platter in her kitchen safe. The doors of the safe was made of tin with nail holes punched in it. The stranger could smell them beans, and he got mighty hungry. The folks only had one bed, so the stranger laid down on one side and the woman on the other. The man, he slept in the middle of the bed, of course. Away in the night, there comes a hell of a racket out by the barn somewhere. It's them damn chicken thieves again, says the man. He jumped up and grabbed his shotgun, and then he made a run for the chicken house without even stopping to put on his shoes. Soon as he was gone, the woman nudged the traveler and whispered, "Stranger, now's your chance." So the fellow got up, opened the kitchen safe, and ate the rest of them beans. Thank you. Thank you.